if I could, I'll begin. Today, this is a workshop, and the format is going to be a little different from normal. The whole idea is to kind of change the structure, to be interactive today, to do what you can to, as a group, learn collectively as much as we can provide you from staff, and as much you can ask questions from staff about the things that are tied to removing the remnant buildings that the Army left us here on Fort Ord. So before we get into all of those details, I also want to give you a little bit of the rules of the house for today. We intend to have a PowerPoint presentation that will be provided by staff. Once that's done, we'll have an opportunity for board members to exchange ideas, thoughts, and questions with staff, and then an opportunity for the public also to participate and make comment after the board members have that chance. But we want to make this workshop format interactive among board members as much as we possibly can. We also are going to try to do something that gives us an opportunity to have a little fun with this subject today. It's not a funny subject, it's not even humorous, but we can have a little fun as we learn through the process. And so staff suggested we do something that engages both board members and the public in understanding and looking at questions about building removal. What are the real answers? So I'm going to ask Mary Israel from our staff, who did a lot of work in making this happen. But before we get there, Mary, is this what's on the board, what everybody has to do? So that means members of the public, members of, well, you staff members know you'll skew the answers, no way. But everybody else, log in to 605 local if you haven't already. That includes you too, Christy Reimer. The password is 605 local, and once you've done that, and whatever web browser you're using, whether it's Google or Safari or one of those other locations, go to kahoot.it. While we're waiting, I think maybe this will be a good opportunity for me to make a few opening comments. I started making a couple of comments about building removal and how important it is. Just to give you a little history and background for those of you who may not have been here in the beginning, unlike Ron Cheshire, who was here before I was. There's a number of issues that are tied with this building removal that go even before the Fort Ord Reuse Authority was created. In fact, when the testimony was being taken about the issues at Fort Ord and how to create a local recovery or a local redevelopment authority, the issues of the remnant buildings were already coming up. Should these be used for homeless? What's going to, should they be a part of a major program? And what the Army had discovered, and what all of us wound up finding out, was that these buildings have many, many issues that make them nearly impossible for them to be used in an effective way, no matter who it's for, whether it's for commercial, residential, or even light industrial purposes, and it's because of the construction at an earlier time. So because of that, in the 1990s, the base reuse plan looked rather heavily at the kind of recovery that would replace those buildings with an economic recovery based in education, based in environmental conservation, for the same principles that pretty much are effective in this region. In fact, that particular base reuse plan provided a platform for the negotiations with the United States Army about the property transfers. It looked at effectively, from whether it was in Seaside or Marina or the county, how those buildings and the cost of having to remove them would affect future recovery, because there was a substantial cost. But back in those days, the Army's told us that this property was worth $350 million. We said, well, that would make some sense, but it's going to cost $300 million just to remove the buildings so that it would be eligible for recovery programs. And the very hefty cost of having to spend $300 million and carrying those charges was a significant problem. Our colleagues in Shea Homes know a lot about that cost. So what eventually happened was our base reuse plan and the work that we had done set the platform for winding up with what Sam Farr called a no-cost economic development conveyance. In fact, when Sam was in office, he often would say to the FORA board, no costs don't mean free. In fact, this board and the individual jurisdictions wound up absorbing a substantial amount of cost in order to get access to the property to enable the recovery program for all of the region. So that's an important piece of information. In fact, what we have been doing is getting rid of 90 years of building for a completely different purpose than a municipal purpose, for a military purpose that often looked at the urgency of the military mission, which is slightly different than when we're building a neighborhood in Carmel or Pacific Grove or Seaside or Marina. So what the Army left us with was approximately 3,500 buildings of over 4,000. I'm giving you that number now. This is a secret. You might find it on the test. That offer little or no reuse for civilian purposes. In fact, the construction ranged from the 1930s to the late 1980s, and some of that construction, even the later construction in the 1980s, still had the use of materials we now know are either carcinogenic or have some other impact on our lives. Lead-based paint, asbestos, and Stan, and we'll talk to you a lot about that later. These buildings are all from what is the largest Army closure to date. I mention that because we're not alone. In the work that we do here at Fort Ord, there are another 25 bases like us across the state of California and another 120 across the country that are dealing with similar issues, not to the extent that we are. As I mentioned, this is the largest Army closure, and the Army is known for its World War II wood buildings. We probably are facing the most difficult challenge in building removal in the nation in that regard. So those are some important points. I know several of you who recently or in the last couple of years participated in national conferences, heard a little bit about the kind of things that we have to confront when we're dealing with this. So I'll let Stan talk about just how cost prohibitive some of these things are, the process we went through over 20 years to get there. But I do want to point out that we have done everything we possibly can at staff, and we're looking for the opportunity today to add to what we've discovered about the complexities, the difficulties, the burdens that we have to face about building removal from ideas that we hope to get from board members or questions. Maybe the answers we provide will give us a new opening that we haven't heard before. But we've tried everything from the subsidy that we provide for building removal in individual circumstances, to special financing from the state, to trying to apply for federal dollars through brownfields. We've done lots of things to try to address this, and we work directly with the individual developers by signing manifests or doing some other items. You'll hear more detail about this from Stan in a few minutes. So whether it's the cost-related issues, or it's the disposal of hazardous materials, or it's the barrier that the actual in-your-face appearance of these buildings that create barriers to our full economic recovery, we want to see what today's exchange, in a comfortable way, can give to this whole region. And as the board members, we at staff are looking to try to find a way to implement your policies. At the end of this discussion today, we'll kind of give you the 3 or 4 areas where there should be maybe some policies discussion in some future meeting. This is all about exchanging information and getting it on the table in a way that the board members will have the full background for making changes, direction, or maybe policy adjustments. So I think Mary's ready.
Hi everybody, good morning. So if you're at kahoot.it, I just started the game. The game pin is 148300. So we've overcome the slow Wi-Fi on the laptop. We're going to do the questions on a PowerPoint, but I have the game running on my phone. The pin is 148300. Is everybody in? I'm waiting for players. No. 1483. Okay, we have one in, so it's working. Here you go, Com. Yay. So Michael's going to read the questions.
So we'll give it a couple more minutes while we... Well, and while we're waiting for it to all come up and everybody to get linked, I just want to take a minute to thank the members of the staff that really did a lot of extra work to make this possible for folks to get visual support for this whole discussion and the background information. We looked through documents that lead all the way back to 1992 and 93 to try to make sure that we had a comprehensive look at this for everyone. When you all came in, you saw boards outside that showed a contrast between what it looked like when the property came to FORA initially, and then as the jurisdictions developed, and Marina in particular, you can see the contrast between before and after, what it looks like. And I want to thank, where is Nick? Stand up, Nick. For any of you who haven't met Nick, this is Nicholas Prue. He is our new intern from California State University, Monterey Bay, and he's responsible for the boards that you saw outside today. He got a little help from Josh, who helped us with some mapping, but Josh is down in Seaside talking about affordable housing with a group of neighborhoods that asked for him to speak this morning on affordable housing. So Stan, Jonathan, Josh, Mary, Steve Ensley, Helen Rodriguez, Sherry didn't do anything. Sherry Damon, Sherry Damon, all participated quite actively, along with a little support in the background from Robert Norris about getting all of this together. So now that everybody's linked in, looks like. So Cynthia's in. So okay, we're good. Yes, Gail.
May I ask a question regarding your opening comments? Just one of the things that you mentioned was the brownfields as a funding source, and I know that those of us that served on PRAC earlier on, the post reassessment subcommittee, was that there was a huge discussion about why we're a super fund that eliminates our ability to apply for brownfield funds from the federal government, brownfields being able to help us with blight. Superfund, the money's going to regenerate the underground water, etc. So if you could just perhaps say if that's still true, did legislation change? It's just
no, legislation hasn't changed.
That to have people understand that also.
In the federal government, there are a number of different funding sources for many different things. You might be able to get funding from the Economic Development Administration, for example, to do a road, but you can also get money from the Department of Transportation, depending upon what that road does. Another example would be this specific circumstance. In the federal government, there are multiple different laws that govern how you address the remediation of remnant hazards and materials. It includes something called CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Coordination, and Liability Act. CERCLA is the same or equal to what has been commonly known as the Superfund law. And Congress enabled the Department of Energy and several other departments joining together to access funds under CERCLA, the Superfund law, for cleaning up military installations, cleaning up other hazardous sites, cleaning up materials that would be threatening to humans and the environment. Under this law, the Fort Ord, fence to fence, all of Fort Ord has been processed for cleanup, and that cleanup is tied directly to the cleanup of the underlying aquifers from years of United States Army disposal of waste in the landfills. That declaration under CERCLA, under Superfund, happened in the 1980s, before Fort Ord was closed. I think Doug was at 85 or 86, one of those years. They closed the landfill. They stopped disposing of waste in the landfill. That also stemmed some of the contamination into the subsurface aquifer, but the reason why in Marina you can't dig a well all the way into the county areas on Fort Ord is because those aquifers still remain contaminated from that Army disposal of waste in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So under CERCLA, they provided lots of dollars. CERCLA provided money for the cleanup. The Army is added to that from base realignment and closure funds to the cleanup of the subsurface aquifers. But under federal law, you can't get funding from two different sources. It's a duplicate funding. And so brownfields law is for those entities that are cleaning up properties or reusing properties on areas not designated under CERCLA. So Gail, I know that's a longer answer than you wanted. Correct.
Looking for additional federal money is something that CLAC considered, because blight was one of the priorities that we tried to address, as ineffective as our outcomes have been. But there was a tremendous discussion about why aren't we asking for this or that, and the brownfields have been used in so many other jurisdictions successfully for this kind of problem that it seemed like an obvious answer, and you've explained why it's not. Thank you.
So thank you for the question, and it allows me to say when we get into the PowerPoint presentation, Jonathan will be talking to you about 5 or 6 other options that we've looked at. Okay? Are we ready now, Mary? Okay. Oh.
So I apologize, the Wi-Fi is not strong enough for everybody. We have about 10 players in, and what we should do is go ahead and we'll go ahead and do the quiz. If you don't have your clicker loaded on your phone, you just take note of your answer on your paper in front of you. And Michael will be asking the questions on this slide, and you can just move ahead like that. Have fun.
Okay. And you're going to drive, and I'm going to talk, okay? So the first question is a true-false question. This one should be easy. You just heard the answer. 7,000 buildings were left when the Army vacated Fort Ord in 1994. True or false? Let's see what the answers are. Everybody have answers in? Okay. All right, you have the answers? Okay. The right answer is, just for those that are not aware, there are actually a number of numbers that you'll see floating around about this issue. So one of the issues, one of the numbers you'll see is this 7,000 number that is really just a made-up number. It really never was 7,000. There's something like 6,000 or 6,200 buildings on the base, somewhere, shape, or form. However, the Army kept a lot of those. About 5,700 is the number they tried to explain that they were getting rid of in the disposal program. What actually wound up coming to FORA and then being transferred to underlying jurisdictions was about 4,000. You heard me say that before. And we'll talk a little bit later in the presentation about just how many of those have been taken down and how many might be left, which is, I think, 600 or 700, but I will look at the actual number a little bit later. But that's the answer. So, now the next question is, FORA owns approximately what percent of the buildings on the former Fort Ord? This is, what does FORA own as of today? Are the answers coming through? Oh, we got quite a few more people around. We got 12 answers already. Who's going to tell us? All right, has everyone answered? Okay, so the answer to the question is 0. At one time, FORA owned quite a bit of buildings here, but over time we've transferred all the properties that FORA's owned to the underlying jurisdiction. We have an agreement that makes that the case. We still own, though, around 3,000 acres of land. There used to be some buildings on that land, but as we have cleared munitions, we've also cleared buildings. So we own property, we don't own buildings. That's the answer to your question. Is it up there? So, what has not inhibited or prevented building removal and reuse on former Fort Ord? First, limited funding and funding restrictions. Second, hazardous materials integrated in building structures. Army didn't build to civil building codes, it's the uniform building code. We said civil because uniform was the original term, but now there are 4 or 5 different codes that we use. And the Army built indestructible buildings. What was not inhibited or prevented from building removal? Everyone answered? What's the answer, Stan?
The Army did not build indestructible buildings as demonstrated in the photo up there.
All right. We have heard that a number of places, that the Army built in indestructible ways. It's true that the Army did everything it could to make the World War II wood buildings last longer. The Army was concerned that termites were going to cause a problem. They were concerned that salt air was going to cause a problem. They used gasoline, lead gasoline, to improve the penetrability of the lead-based sealers on the wood buildings so that the wood would last longer. Fact, not fiction. Okay. All right. FORA has removed former Fort Ord buildings by burning. True or false? This one's pretty straightforward. Everybody got an answer in? The answer is false. We actually have, though, used buildings for fire training, several of them in Marina. I think the city manager in Marina, John Longley, wanted to help the fire department. I think he was part of, Doug, do you remember, was he part of the emergency response team with the fire? And he was also part of the airport squad, and he had all these folks. So they had fire training, but we didn't intentionally destroy or demolish buildings through fire. Good call. Next is, in 2007, the FORA board adopted a policy to financially assist jurisdictions with building removal. True or false? Everyone have an answer in? At the end, you're going to know how folks answered because all those answers are being compiled by Mary. The answer is true. Okay. Next item. Next question. I think this is the last question, right? Land sales revenue is a main funding source for building removal. True or false? This is a very hard one. All right, I think everybody got that right. I hope everybody understand that. The answer is true. Next. So we're still getting answers, right? All right. Next question. Building removal is part of the FORA Capital Improvement Program. True or false? If you think this is a trick question, it is. All right, everyone responded? What'd you say, Doug? It is part of the capital improvement program. We get a lot of questions about this because many have, in the community, believe that our CIP is all about environmental mitigations, which is true, but not all. the environmental mitigations and our community facility districts are part of our capital improvement program, and building removal has always been a part of it. And is that it? That's the end of the questions. All right. All right. Okay, so that was just a little bit of an idea, just a little icebreaker about some of the items, but now you're going to hear a PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to turn this over to Stan Cook so he can give you the background and history. There are copies of the PowerPoint in front of you. I'm asking if you would write down a question if you have one or two, unless it's really burning and you see something on the board that you have to have right now. I'd like to go through this. It's about 35-40 minutes of presentation.
All right. My name is Stan Cook. You usually know me as the munitions cleanup guy. So the question in your mind should be, what is a munitions cleanup guy doing up here to talk about building removal? So I'd like to introduce myself. Before that, I'd like to say that once again, all of FORA staff helped with this. There was a lot of background research on this. Jonathan and I will be making the presentations, but there was a lot of help from all of staff, and a lot of people covered for us while we were pulling information together. To introduce myself, I came up here from San Diego. I worked for 12 years in San Diego as an estimator for a demolition company. So I had 12 years of experience removing. Our company either removed or, I estimated, and we removed thousands of buildings, ranging from the size of homes to the size of malls. In 1994, I returned to school to get my bachelor's degree. I went to UC Santa Cruz. I was an intern under Michael, and I was studying community studies, and I focused on military base reuse as my focus in my community studies. In 1996, I was hired by UC Santa Cruz Extension to work on their, to manage a building salvage research program that they had, specifically wanting to work on Fort Ord and the property they received on Fort Ord. In 1996, I was hired by FORA to manage the Packard Grant Pilot Deconstruction Project, and I'll explain more about that project in a bit. It's a project where, for FORA to research the building removal needs on the former Fort Ord. Okay. So an introduction into this workshop. This workshop encompasses 20 years of building removal on the former Fort Ord. We're going to go through the history, first of FORA research, then we're going to talk a little bit about other building removal projects. We're going to talk about Seaside Highlands. We're going to talk about the dunes. We're going to talk about Sea Haven, which is Marina Heights. We're going to talk about East Garrison. And then we're going to talk about some FORA removal actions. What has FORA actually moved? Some of those completed removals have to do with road work, road projects we put in. The ESCA is taking down some buildings. And there was quite a lot of research in all of those projects. So we'll also talk about what are FORA's remaining obligations. Then Jonathan will talk about financing, talking about what's currently used for financing. We'll talk about elements of financing, break it down so that there are simple formulas to see, so you see how the money comes and goes. We want to talk about the future. We want to talk about opportunities and options that may be available to the board. Let me give you a quick description of this picture. The picture in the upper right-hand corner is a building that's been abated of hazards. It's being demolished and aggressively recycled. The building in the bottom is being deconstructed, where you take all the components of the building apart by hand and see what is you save the salvageable portions. Both of these fit under the definition of building removal in the project in this presentation. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the Fort Ord closure. Let me orient you real quickly. Up on this side, this is, of course, the ocean. This is Marina, the original Marina. This is Marina boundary right about here. It was extended in 1974 while the base was still open. Seaside, this is historic Seaside. This is Seaside that was extended in 1974. Down here we have Delray Oaks. We have the city of Monterey. This is the airport, and this is Ryan Ranch right here. So this is Butts Ryan Ranch. Laguna Seca is right here. This is the county's East Garrison project in this area. Reservation Road runs down here along this side and then comes through here and ends up hitting Highway 68 right here, which is in this area. If you look at that map, most of it's covered with areas that are habitat management or open spaces. The area that's in pink is the area that the Fort Ord Reuse Authority is dealing with base reuse. That also, if you notice, agrees with where most of the buildings are on former Fort Ord. And that was intentional. The base reuse plan, one of the concepts there was for sustainability to reuse the property that had been used most by the Army. Okay, here's a number of buildings, 4,000 buildings, over 100 square feet. The Army has a really good database of buildings when they left the former Fort Ord. It doesn't exactly meet the needs for civilian use, but it allows you to be able to sort them. But the buildings are included in that database with facilities. So if you take just the database and look at it, you get a very high number. It's facilities, I mean manholes, I mean baseball diamonds, I mean parking lots, things that we're not talking about buildings. So if you take that database and sort it for over 100 square feet, you get very close to 4,000 buildings. Okay? So anything less than that is not what I'm adding to my count when I talk about this. Another thing that's important to know is that when I'm talking about buildings, I'm using building count. I could use square footage of building and what type of buildings they are, but most people can visualize a building. It's very hard to visualize 1,000 square feet, 10,000, 1,500,000 square feet. So I'm using buildings here. Under federal law, FORA received the property and will transfer to the jurisdiction with the buildings on it. They're as is, where is. Under federal law, the buildings are assets. They may not look like assets to the jurisdictions, but to the federal government, they're assets. Of those 4,000 buildings, about 78% are wood, and concrete are about 22%. That goes from concrete buildings that were houses in the city of Seaside, Seaside Highlands area. What's that? Hayes Housing has some, yes. And then also all the way up to these very large hammerhead buildings right here. Those are maybe 60, 80,000 square feet. So they're very large. There's not as many in number, but there's some that are very large, so it's a big problem, as you'll see. There were a lot of wood buildings. Most of those are under 4,000 square feet. There were some that are a little bigger, but there's others that were not. So I'm going to get a little bit more into the hazards on the next slide, so I'm going to pass it, next few slides, so I'll pass that by. Here's a building removal status map. It's very hard to see. It's quite accurate. Josh put it together, did a very nice job. But what I want to use this for is to point out a few things to you. Remember that map with the pink in it, the base reuse map? That pretty much coincides with where these buildings are. We have a little bit of other spaces that are available and that are outside this, but basically, if you can't reuse a building, it's got to go to accomplish our base reuse that we're trying to do here. You also notice that the buildings are not evenly distributed. There's county property out here that has less buildings. This in the middle is CSUMB. They have some buildings here. Looks like a different style of building here. no buildings here. So what I want you to take away from this is that the buildings are not evenly distributed throughout the jurisdictions and on the former Fort Ord. The starting point on evaluating these buildings, once again I said, was the Army database, but there was a demo estimate, survey done by Reimer and Associates in 1996, and the building removal and status of it has been tracked in your CIP documents from about 1996 to today. Okay. So let me talk a little bit about building removal challenges. Let me show you what's in these pictures. Oops. This is siding, a close-up of siding from our buildings. That is the red is from a lead swab test. When you, they produce these swabs that you can put on paint, and if you put it on paint and it turns red, there's a high probability that the paint contains lead. I took some of these boards, we cut them to the side, and I wanted to know how deep the lead had penetrated into the wood. I put that red swab on it, and you can see it. It's soaked into the wood quite a ways. Part of the reason that is because back in the 40s when they were painting and they wanted to dilute paint, make it thinner, make it easier to spread, they cut the paint with leaded gasoline. So the lead from the gasoline, when the gasoline was thin, it sucked into the wood. The gasoline volatiles evaporated, and you're left with the lead in the wood. So you'll see later this plays into our concept of trying to plane the wood to salvage it. This building up here, with the people walking around in it, is a building ready to be demolished and recycled at CSUMB. That was about $750,000 or more to get the building to that state. That is one of the Hammerhead buildings. Those buildings had what we call a skim coat on it, and the skim coat was basically to cover up all the voids that are now exposed in that concrete, so when someone went to live in it, it looked nice and neat and clean. Down below we have men working to remove hazardous materials. Through our deconstruction project, one of the things we did is we took buildings apart piece by piece, and what we found is there's layer upon layer of hazardous material. So what you see on the surface may not even test for hazardous materials, but what may be under 2 or 3 layers under me. We found floor tile that the top tile was not hazardous, but we had 4 layers of asbestos tiles underneath. The other thing, skim coat is drywall mud that contains asbestos fibers in it, and the asbestos fibers are used to keep the skim coat from cracking as it dries. So, but it's asbestos containing, and you cannot recycle the concrete with the asbestos in it. The other problem here that's a challenge is just the sheer number of buildings. It's very hard to deal with the number of buildings that we're dealing with here. So what did the FORA board do about this? The first thing they did is they started research. This portion of the diagram shows the research that occurred from 1996 to 2005. Bear with me while I give you a good description of this. The board applied for and received a grant from the Packard Foundation to look at what materials could be salvaged out of the buildings here, with the idea you could reduce building removal costs by salvaging materials. Right about the same time that we received Fort Ord, the EPA was, their lead-based paint laws were kicking in, and they were becoming stricter and stricter with what could be reused and from the building materials. So for a deconstruction project, we started in '96, it went through 2002. We looked at, through that process, what we did is we took buildings apart piece by piece. One thing we found is that buildings are not redwood. Many people, that's a rumor that's out there that they're redwood. They're Douglas fir. We took the clean materials and sold many of them to see what the market value was. We also took time to identify the hidden hazards because we took disassembled these buildings piece by piece and weighed. We actually weighed every piece of these buildings. We identified hidden hazards that were in there, and that, once again, like I said, surface may be non-hazardous, but that may have been used to contain hazardous materials that are in the building. We move on to the FORA asbestos research. It was part of the pilot deconstruction process. We focused on asbestos contamination. Where was it? What materials was it in? And then potential mitigations. We actually even looked at working with a company to recycle asbestos. Their technology worked great for asbestos that was salvaged or taken out of submarines that are being decommissioned. Very concentrated asbestos. Ours was not concentrated. It didn't work out. We also looked at ways to encapsulate asbestos so that if you're reusing a building, it wouldn't be a hazard to the occupants. For a lead-based paint study, we focused on the lead-based paint contamination and potential mitigations. The best we could come up with was encapsulation. FORA characterization. This is when we worked with Department of Toxic Substance Control to come up with a characterization for the waste that would be generated by the entire volume of World War II wood buildings that would come off the former Fort Ord. We were actually able to do that for a set number of buildings. That information we use to explore disposal options. If you know what your waste stream is, it's still hazardous, but it's a certain type of hazard. We went to the Marine Coast Landfill and asked them to go to DTSC and seek a variance so the material from here could go 6 miles down the road instead of 9 hours away. Excuse me, 4.5 hours away, 9-hour trucking route. We also did the FORA CSUMB recovery, and that was where we looked at, can you plane the lead-based paint off of the siding on these buildings? As I showed you, the reason is you can never pass the HUD test is because you take off what you can see, you can't get rid of the lead. So, and it was not economically viable. We produced something that looked like flooring without the tongue and groove, and it was already cost 4 to 5 times more than you could buy virgin material. So what do? The board actually produced all this research here. At that point, they started applying it. They started applying it in policy. So I'm going to switch to that here real quick. Okay, let's quickly go through these research benefits. The building removal cost estimate in the base reuse plan was somewhere around $200 million. EDC negotiations, potentially $300 million. There was another idea of $300 million. There was the Reimer estimate, was one estimate. So the board wanted additional verification of that. We were able to come up with that more specifically to the building types. The board identified select areas where FORA would provide assistance to the jurisdictions to help them with their building removal. And those are captured in contracts, and Jonathan will explain a little bit more of that later. They created the hierarchy of building reuse. Now, many people have heard about the hierarchy of building reuse. It seems to have, the concept there seems to have morphed a little bit over time. So I want to go back to what it originally was for. It was to guide jurisdictions and their developers as they looked at project areas to do a first cut. Are the buildings reusable? Should you just blanketly say, let's tear them all down and start from scratch, or are there some buildings that are reusable? That had quite an impact on what we have here on Fort Ord today and the safety that we have here. The next was relocate and reuse. This is a picture of the Army relocating buildings. That one's going to East Garrison, out of the main garrison. Looks pretty simple. Scale it up a little bit and you could use a little bigger. There's no telephone lines in there. There's no street crossings. There's no bridges in that. Those impact the cost of being able to do that. Also, the Army at that point, they didn't care about lead-based paint. They didn't care about the specter of it. What it turned out to be that by the time you could meet building code at the other end with one of these buildings, you had to pretty much tear it apart to the point where it was just 2x4s and a roof. You could bring in virgin material and build 2x4s and a roof way cheaper than you could ever get to that point with these buildings. So that was not economically feasible. The next was deconstruct and reuse materials. Well, reuse of building materials, the high dollar stuff is in your fancy things like mantles, ornate woodwork, that kind of thing. We don't have it. We've got structural members. Extremely hard to remove all of the hazardous materials that are in these buildings to end up with just a few structural materials that you can buy way cheaper on the market. The other thing is, well, I'll stop with that. It was cost prohibitive. The last thing in there is demolish and aggressively recycle. We found that once the hazards are removed, the materials can be aggressively recycled. We get about 90 to 95% out of all of our projects. A lot of that material goes back into, it's been used in the Dunes project, in the infiltration basins. It's been used under the parking lots. It's been used on all the roads we have here. It's been used for landscaping, maintenance of weeds, that kind of thing. Okay. The hidden hazards in these buildings. When, under the hierarchy, if you decide you want to reuse a building, our hidden hazards that we found in the pilot deconstruction project help these reuse efforts go in when they're doing remodeling to go in and find those hazardous materials quickly, identify them, and not have extras and things like that when they were doing the work. So it benefited places like MPC, Goodwill Services, Golden Gate University, and the rehabbing of their buildings. The next thing down here needs a little bit of explanation. It's the board's decision to sign on as a hazardous waste generator for the materials that come off of the projects on Fort Ord. Specifically, it's captured in the Dunes FORA Marine Community Partners MOA agreement. And that's where FORA steps in and signs as the hazardous waste generator for the hazardous waste that leave the Dunes project. What does that mean? This is an example of that Dunes project. That pile of papers on the left are hazardous waste manifests. Each one of those represents a truckload, 20-ton truckload. There's 5 reams of paper on the other side, so that's about 2,500 manifests. That's for half the buildings in the Dunes project. The hazardous waste generator fee for that. Now, FORA is exempt from that as a government agency cleaning up somebody else's mess. We saved the developer about $1.1 million there. That's current fees. Those haven't changed very much over time. The other thing is because your sign is a generator. Yes? Okay. Which part don't you understand? Go ahead. These are manifest, or shipping. Manifest is a shipping document that goes with each load of hazardous material that leaves the former Fort Ord. Hazardous waste manifests are very structured so that you know that your material that's leaving the site goes to the landfill and that the landfill receives it. It doesn't end up in someone's backyard or something. Okay. That's fine. Yeah, you know, this is exactly what we're here for. Yes, Gail?
So you're indicating that if a private entity had to ship this, that we would incur, the private entity, XYZ company, would pay $22.70 per ton to dump its hazardous waste. But because FORA is a governmental entity, it is exempt from having to pay. So the savings to the private ABC corporation is $1.1 million, and the contribution that the federal government is giving to this cleanup here is $1.1 million in savings.
Yes.
Is that what this slide is telling
Yes,
us?
that's what it's
Thank
telling
you.
us. Okay. Okay, other policies and practices that FORA has adopted. One is to deduct the cost for fair market value from the land sales. So this example here, you'll see it again. So I'm just going to go through it quickly. If property is valued at $100 and the building removal is $50, the net land sale price would be $50. Of that, FORA gets half of it, and the jurisdictions get half of it. So it trickles down. The property value may have been $100 less the building removal, leaves $25 for each FORA and the jurisdiction. The board identified some special projects as base-wide obligations, meaning that they needed some additional help. The policy is adopted in the FORA CIP. So if you want to see where this is, there's nothing real clean about this. This is in the FORA CIP. That's pretty clean, but you're not going to see a policy that's standalone on this. It was done to assist the jurisdictions. These were obligations that at the time no one else wanted or could do. It also took into account the uneven building removal burden across different jurisdictions. So some jurisdictions had, like Marina, had more building removal. Seaside had more. Delray Oaks had less. Yes. Yes. Okay. And Jonathan will go through that. He's going to break these down. Yes, sir. Each agency, each project that FORA has provided a supplement for, we have signed the hazardous waste manifest for, which gives them that ability to be excluded from that excise fee. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about FORA's actual building removal activities. The pilot deconstruction project, I talked about that. I'll give you numbers on how many buildings were moved during that project in just a minute, but that happened through 1996 to 2000. Road projects, we did Imgen Parkway and we did 2nd Avenue. We did General Jim Moore, there were no buildings removed there, but in Imgen Parkway and 2nd Avenue, we removed quite a few buildings. We did remedial activities under the Environmental Services Cooperative Agreement. Sure, we were taking out munitions and explosives of concern, but we also removed some buildings. For lease compensation, on Imgen Parkway, there's a gravel lot to the south of Imgen Parkway, about a quarter mile from here. That's an area that Granite Construction leased from FORA so they could crush material that they were generating as they were doing work on Imgen Parkway and recycle it and reuse it in Imgen Parkway 2nd and other projects on the base. So to compensate for that, they removed some buildings, and they removed 10 of those in Marina and 1 in Surplus 2, or City of Seaside. FORA has provided quite a bit of financial support to other projects. That comes in the form of money, credit, land sales value. FORA has, in the FORA hazmat exemption that I just talked to you about. That means the manifest exemption. We'll call it that. Technical support. What FORA learned from all their research, they were able to help Seaside Highlands. We deconstructed one of the cement houses that were there. We got all the information on that house. We gave it to Kaufman and Broad. They took that information, scaled it up, and used it to remove the hazards, and the whole subdivision was very successful for them. CSUMB, we helped them with their wood buildings. They've turned around and helped us with concrete buildings since, so it's reciprocal. We helped MPC, we helped Chartwell School, Golden Gate University, Marina Heights, and East Garrison. That's what technical support. That means access to us who have information and with the regulatory agencies. So FORA building removal. Pilot deconstruction project, we removed 11 buildings. We disassembled those by hand. from the large barracks down to the small, what they call day rooms. We also relocated some buildings, but I'll talk to you about that in a minute. We did road projects. We did Imjin Parkway and 2nd Avenue. We took 37 buildings out. Environmental Services Cooperative Agreement, we took 6 buildings out of there. And I'll show you examples of these in a minute. And then for lease compensation, we took out 11 buildings. FORA funds or land value reduction. The Dunes, that took out 393 buildings. Sea Haven, that paid for 290 buildings to come out. East Garrison, 133 buildings. Seaside Highlands, 401 buildings. So our total that FORA has somehow helped remove the buildings is about 1,282 buildings. This is Imjin Parkway. It's almost looking at where we're at now. We would be over in here. This is where the Chomps facility sits, right in here. The road actually comes up through here. So the Chomps sits right around here. These are Pine Hill. These are buildings that have been removed by the Dunes project. And this is removing those buildings so that we can put Imjin Parkway in. These are large barracks buildings. These are the smaller day rooms. This was Marina Coast Water District's headquarters for many years, or at least their headquarters on Fort Ord. There's a latrine. This is a convenient place for soldiers to discard military munitions. Pretty good sized hole right there. So what we did is we had to clean those out. We removed those buildings. This is the area in Marina that the Granite lease, they removed these buildings so they could use that lot there. I'm going to talk about this one. This is an old theater. It's pretty close to where FORA's office is right now. These offices are. This was removed. And I'm going to tell you more about a second theater we found on 2nd Street. This is the old Marina Coast Water District office. Before it looked like the previous picture, but this was removed during the Imjin Parkway realignment. What I want to tell you about the second building, this theater, see how big it is? It's quite big. It's lined with lots and lots of asbestos because the film was very flammable at the time. The projection areas, the screens, the behind the stage that was in it. One of these burnt on 2nd Avenue while it was owned by the Army. That burnt building, the Army pushed it into the foundation because the foundation slopes, so chairs can, seats can go, theater seating can be in there. They filled it with that asbestos and ash, and when we were doing, then they covered it with dirt. We were doing the work through Imjin Parkway, we found it. It had to be cleaned up. Now, to answer, a lot of people like to joke about burning these buildings. You actually release a lot of materials into the air. Lead, asbestos becomes extremely friable. The ash is dangerous. You have to clean it up anyway, and you have to take it, you have to remove it. So there's no cost savings to do these buildings after they're burnt. All right, now we're back to the overview map. Josh has added some data for us here. And so I'd like to talk about this for a minute. The sheer number of buildings, once again, make it very hard to make simple, easy maps that I can share with everybody. Josh has tried something different. He's tried to do aerial photos, one from 1998 to 2016, and overlay them so as we click through these, and I'll try and go slow, you can see where all of a sudden buildings are gone. So we'll look at that. Here's the status, overall status. 48% of the buildings on Fort Ord have been removed. 17% are to be removed. That means that's what remains. And 35% have been reused. This right here shows the effect of that board policy to look the hierarchy of reuse, to look at, can we reuse these before you just tear them down? Okay, let me give you a status report on the building removal. This is Jerry looking for his buildings right there. Jerry, there are no buildings over 100 square feet on your property. Monterey had the same look when they were looking over at Jerry. They're not in the picture, but there's no buildings for them either. MPC still has 7 World War II buildings to remove. They're actually behind us in the far side of the parking lot over there. It's a strange conveyance that they received, but it's just north of the Veterans Transition Center. Other non-transfer status, this I'm going to use this map right here. This is South Boundary Road. This is, bear with me. Other transfers, I kind of messed up here. Let me go back. Delray Oaks is right here. South Boundary Road is here. Monterey is here, and this is the property that they're both going to receive that have no buildings on it. Okay, sorry about not orienting you for earlier. TAMC, other non-FORA transfers. TAMC has received buildings. There's about 7 of them as an economic development conveyance, an EDC. The Veterans Transition Center has received some buildings as a public benefit conveyance. MST has received some property, some buildings as a public benefit conveyance. The importance of that is that for public benefit conveyances, FORA cannot step in as the hazardous waste generator. The property did not transfer through FORA. It went to a federal sponsor, and that federal sponsor then gave it to the entities like Veterans Transition Center and MST. There are deed restrictions on their property. They're seen as assets. It's very complex. So we've not been able to help them on that, signing the manifest for them. So let me talk to you about CSUMB's building removal status. This is the housing in CSUMB. They reuse those. These are buildings that were within a large parking lot in CSUMB that's used by Pebble Beach. These are green buildings, are the ones that they've removed so far. There's only 3 hammerheads left. These are the large concrete buildings, the hammerheads. This is their quad, so they reuse these buildings. They've reused some of these as Panetta Institute in this area, right there in that building. There's the gym that they've reused. So the CSUMB has reused quite a few buildings and removed quite a few more. Okay. The wood ones, we helped them take those out by giving the information we collected in the pilot deconstruction project. Oops. In these hammerheads here, they were ahead of us with removing concrete buildings. That information you'll see in a minute is very useful to us now as we help with Seaside with surplus too. So here's one of Josh's maps. Let me orient you a little bit. Of course, Highway 1, Seaside Main Gate Project. These are the hammerheads that are in CSUMB here. So I would say watch this area here as buildings are removed. Watch this area here. And if you want to spend a little time with this presentation is going to be uploaded to our website, so you can go on and work with it. Or it's on the posters that are outside. See? I'll go back. So watch this area here. See how there's just white spots where those buildings removed? So they've done quite a bit of removal in this area. This is a little before all the hammerheads are gone, but there's a large area where the hammerheads have been removed. Okay, next is I'm going to talk about Seaside's building removal status. This is the Highlands, Seaside Highlands down here. Ward Military Community in here. This is surplus 2, and so let me give you a little bit of information on that. Surplus 2, as you can see, that remains. These are hammerhead buildings here, very similar to the CSUMB, or the same as CSUMB's right here. So you can see where the data and the information CSUMB is getting is helping us at surplus 2. So here's surplus 2's hammerheads. We're not removing them. We're leaving them Seaside has agreed that, and their developer, their chosen developer, that we should leave these and remove these buildings in here. These are called rolling pins. These are some admin buildings. And just to let you know, this is what I was going to give you the update on at the last board meeting. So I'm covering the information. So our status. There's a rolling pin building, 3-story concrete, probably about 60,000 square feet. We've been coordinating constantly with Seaside. We've had industrial hygienists survey the hazardous materials that are inside. That's complete. We now understand the removal scope and cost for hazmat removal and building removal. The next step is to solicit contractors. We're going to remove 17 of the 27 buildings. The buildings we are leaving are the Hammerhead buildings. The target is for us to actually start work fall of this year. Okay, I'm moving out to the county. This is East Garrison. This is East Garrison in 1998. This is Reservation Road coming through here. That's Giggling Road that's turned into Watkins Gate, turns into Watkins Gate in this area. So this area was quite a few pre-World War II wood buildings and some cement buildings that were made by the WPA and are considered historic. They're going to be part of the arts community that's out there. They were actually kitchens. They're kind of pretty looking. They're covered with red tile roofs and stucco siding. But you'll see this area change in a little bit. So there's new houses in, grading at work. Here's those kitchens that were left. They're going to be part of that arts community. The wooden buildings along here have been removed, and the wooden buildings in this area. Another set of buildings that remains here are some stables that rumor has it they were used for, also for World War II prisoners of war. Now, the building removal in for the county is not just in East Garrison. It's also down here, and it's very hard to see on this, but there's some red spots here. That's the ammo supply point. There's 24 buildings in there. Ammo supply point. So the ammo supply point consists of buildings that are called igloos. They're reinforced concrete, walls, ceilings. They're arch-shaped. They're about 3 feet thick. They were reinforced steel, and they were used to store ammunition. One side had a door on it, and it was facing over a canyon, so if the ammunition ignited, it blew up, it would blow it out over the canyon. They could go pick it up, what was left over. Yes, they are, and they're fenced. We used it in the ESCA for our UXO contractor used it for their staging area. So there's 10 igloos, and the rest of the buildings that are there, I think that leaves about 14 are concrete block buildings to be removed. This is the Dunes project. It also includes in this map MST's warehouses here. They own one set of warehouses. The other set right next to it is owned by Marina. There's some MST property down here, 2 or 3 buildings. So when we talk about the Dunes, I'm including that. In this area of the Dunes, there's the roller hockey rink, and there's about 48 buildings here. You'll see pop out by themselves. There's a few other little buildings in here, but watch this area here, about 48 buildings will all of a sudden stand alone. That's right here. That's a recreational conveyance for the city of Marina. You can see here's REI, Target, Best Buy, the Chomps building. There's FORA's complex right now. In the Imgen Office Park complex, these are the buildings that remain up on C-Deck Hill. Right there is those MPC buildings that remain. The old headquarters building was there, that was given to MPC, and for some reason they took those buildings also. Here's Sea Haven. We got a little, this is former Marina Heights. We're going to zoom in on here for a minute. To orient you, this is the old landfill. They took all the landfill out of here, brought it over to this, the Army brought it over to this side and has capped that over in this side. Ward Market is here, Preston Park is here, Cypress Knolls is in this area. So you can see the progress here. Quite a bit of progress. The buildings have been removed from the entire site, and as we know, they're starting to put houses up. So marina building removal status, we talked about portions of it. I want to talk about, orient you. This is Cypress Knolls, so we'll be talking about that. That has not been removed. That's Sea Deck Hill, that's the area right behind us. This is the area where buildings remain in the dunes. These are the TAMC properties. There's the MST property. And here is the stockade, the former stockade. That's MCWD's headquarters there. So this is the stockade. And this is also part of last month's update that I would give the board on building removal. The stockade is not just a stockade. That's a concrete building full of cells, offices in this end, cells all through here. It has, right about here, a basement in it too. So it's got a basement and crawl spaces under here. It has 3 guard towers. It has some additional auxiliary buildings that are around it, a sally port here, and a generator area and a workshop. So part of removing that complex, FORA has been coordinating with Marina. Our industrial hygienist surveys are complete. Our next steps are to review those surveys, work with the engineer and the industrial hygienist to come up with some estimate of the cost to finish removing that building, and then solicit contracts for removal, and the target for that is fall of 2017. You'll also hear that Marina has asked us to look at maybe the possibility of taking the funds for taking down the stockade and apply it for somewhere else on Fort Ord. So just wanted to show you, this is the inside of a cell. That's flaking paint. Some of it's lead-based paint, some of it isn't over the years. The Army used a lot of lead-based paint in World War II buildings. We actually got a congratulatory letter from one of the labs where we sent the lead-based paint for testing, and they congratulated us on having the highest lead content in paint that they'd ever seen. So that was an award we kind of cherished, anyway. Just set the bar for us. But when the Army came to using it in their barracks, lead-based paint in their barracks, in their housing, right around, somebody seems it appears to be around the 50s, they stopped using it in housing. So Cypress Knolls, very little paint. Inside, very little paint in the soil around it. Same thing with the barracks we're finding up in surplus too. The stockade, I haven't read the report yet, so we'll know about that in a little bit. So remaining buildings, this is kind of where we wanted to get to with you, and hopefully bring you along with us. The remaining buildings are here. That's how many? There's about 633 buildings remaining on the former Fort Ord. That's that 17%. FORA supported, we don't support any of the Cypress Knolls removal at this time. The stockade, there's 7 buildings. We're supporting removing 7 of them. The dunes, there's 338 buildings left in the dunes, and we're supporting 338. That says land sales. That's through land value. TAMC, MST, 5 buildings remaining. 4 doesn't have any. That's not part of their special projects to support any of them. Subtotal, 581 buildings remaining in Marina. 345 are supported by FORA to remove. Ammo supply point, this is in the county. There's 24 buildings there. FORA hasn't supported or doesn't have any plans or contracts to support removal of any of those buildings. Surplus 2, there's 27 buildings. We've got a $5.5 million limit that we can support there under the current FORA policy, and that we think can take out 17 buildings. So total buildings remaining, 633. Ones that have some kind of funding to take them down from 4, 362. Another way to look at this is here, in this pie, 48% of the buildings have been removed, 35% have been reused. This shows the success of that hierarchy of building reuse. That hierarchy of building reuse may have had its day. It may all be used up. What we're finding is trying to reuse buildings at this late date, they're just too far gone. The ones that have been able to have been reused have been reused. The aging, the weathering, just the type of structures that are left over, if they don't have foundations, it's very hard to reuse them as buildings. So that leaves, those buildings are 17%, and they are left to be removed. Now 17%, those are the ones you see very easily. So FORA's obligation here in Marina, this is pretty much the dunes, 24 million in cash, 22 million in credit. Those have been paid to be removed. 2.1 million, that's a stockade that's in progress. Seaside, we took out one building, 4470, using the exchange, the rent compensation from Granite Construction. We have 5.5 million more obligated to spend there in surplus 2 to take those 17 of 27 buildings down. The jurisdictions, they have some remaining work to do. As you can see, Marina Heights, Marina Heights is now done. So that should be Cypress Knolls. The dunes, Marina Heights is done. The dunes and Cypress Knolls remain. Seaside Highlands has been done. Surplus 2 remains. Monterey County, they have their historic buildings that they're going to reuse. They need to be reused. Their non-historic buildings, they're gone. CSUMB has removed their wood buildings and metal buildings. They started on their hammerheads. That's a $30 million that the California State University system has allocated to remove buildings there. I'm glad to let you know that CSUMB only has 3 of those left to be removed. That's about $3 million. So that's a tremendous amount of money that the CSU has invested in our area. I really can't say enough about how well we've worked with CSUMB to share information back and forth, how they've been able to springboard and leapfrog off of the research we've done, and as they get information, they share it with us or we ask them for it, and they've been very good at sharing that. So now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Jonathan. I know that was quite long, but it was detailed, and I think it was all information that you could find valuable.
I think we should thank Stan for that. Rather detailed. Thank you very much, Stan. So I think just before Jonathan starts, Stan did what yesterday he finished in 35 minutes. It took him an hour today. Jonathan is a much shorter presentation, really talks about the financing, but it's another 15-20 minutes. Don't you think everybody ought to stand up and move their shoulders and stretch their arms a little bit and kick their legs? And okay, Jonathan, let's get started on the next set. Is everybody ready for the PowerPoints are on your table? You can follow Jonathan as he moves ahead.
Acting Chair Parker and board members, I'm Jonathan Brinkman. I'm going to take this presentation to the end. So far, you've seen from Stan Cook a history, the topic of FORA actions, and current status of building removal on the base. I'm going to cover the topics of financing building removal and future policy options, considerations for the board. And just to give a quick overview of building removal on the base from financial aspects, as Michael and Stan mentioned, these buildings were whereas as is from the Army, and as part of those negotiations in the 1990s for this property, the Army said, this is an asset, you need to pay us a number, 150 million or 100 million for this land. On FORA's side of the negotiating table, we said, well, with these buildings on the site, you need to pay us 50 million and we'll take the property from you because we have to pay for the cost of building removal. So the compromise was a no-cost ADC, as Michael mentioned, with legislation through Congress. So even though we receive the property for free, it isn't free because we have the buildings to take off. So we just financially want to go through some funding mechanisms that FORA has for building removal. From 1998 to 2005, the FORA board established policies on building removal. They set up land sales as a funding mechanism. In 2002, we set up the Melrose District CFD, which funded the base-wide mitigations for transportation, transit, habitat management, and water augmentation. So looking at the different tracks for building removal. So as Stan mentioned, CSUMB, MPC, and others received land, and they are responsible for removing the buildings on their property. FORA has currently 2 tracks. This track is the general approach to building removal, and then I'm going to cover a second track in a moment about additional support that FORA provides for certain areas where the building removal is uneven or more burdensome in some areas because of the World War II barracks or other aspects where FORA is providing additional support. So this is the general support, the general funding policy. First step is we appraise the property. So we do that by looking at comparable sales in the area and setting some property values for the four-door property. And then we look at what the building removal costs are. We do a hazardous materials survey. We use engineers' estimates. We use developers or jurisdictions' estimates. And then we establish a sales price that subtracts out the building removal costs from the value. And then FORA and the jurisdiction split that remaining value 50-50. And then FORA's 50% goes back into building removal. Yes?
FORA's 50% goes back into building removal. Does it site restricted, or does it go back into a general program? But that's an important piece for everybody to understand. So if in fact I sell the promontory in the city of Marina for a reduced price, I give FORA $9 million or $900,000 for that price. That goes into FORA's basket of money for the board to decide where that basket of money is used for building removal, and not on the site specific.
That's correct. Yeah, that's a good example. I mean, with the promontory, the property was valued at something like $2 million. The building removal cost was $1 million, so FORA and Marina split the $1 million that remained.
So can I follow up on that, because I want to understand? So that $50 million hypothetical building removal, is that then with the expectation that the developer removes the buildings from that site-specific property that they bought?
Yes.
Okay.
And then this is the other track where FORA provides additional support to the jurisdiction. So an example of this would be East Garrison or the Dunes on Monterey Bay project. And this is a policy decision. It's usually adjusted with inflation or by board policy or set in a contract. And then the building removal happens at the pace of the development. If it's in phases, then it's taken down in phases. So I'm going to cover the funding limitations. So the FORA Community Facilities District, which was created in 2002, building removal is not an eligible expense for that. The Melrose Law did not allow building removal or hazardous materials as eligible expenses back then. There was a change in amendment in Melrose Law in 2007, which may allow future CFDs to fund the hazardous material remediation portion of building removal. We also have looked at building removal loans. However, those face challenges because lenders don't like the risk of the hazards in the buildings themselves, so they'll seek collateral. So that's something that has been a challenge for us. Also, we've looked at brownfields funding, and as mentioned earlier, since Fort is listed fence line to fence line as a Superfund site, we're not eligible for brownfields funding. This is a graphic to show the movement of funds. So the two middle boxes are funding dollars coming in, either through land sales or property taxes on the right, or from the Community Facilities District fees we collect from development projects before they collect their building permits. So those CFD fees fund the capital improvement projects, the habitat conservation, the water augmentation, the transportation funding. However, not eligible to fund the building removal, so that's the no arrow going down to building removal. And then the land sales and property taxes are the flexible funding. So they fund the building removal first with the land sales, and remaining land sales dollars will fund capital improvement projects. This slide is just to give you a snapshot of looking at forest transition. So FORA's obligations on building removal are going to be zero by 2020. That does not mean that there won't be an underlying jurisdictional obligation for select parcels, but FORA's additional support, as in the CIP, would be accomplished by 2020. And then what would remain in other categories, there would be some remaining obligations in transportation transit, water augmentation, habitat management, And on the ESCA project, the ESCA program, the $7 to $10 million will likely be funded through a grant amendment, which the board authorized Michael to finalize at the last meeting. Getting into some more of the details in these agreements on building removals. So this is just a quick summary of the Dunes on Monterey Bay agreement. So the board approved this additional support in Marina because there were a number of World War II barracks and World War II era buildings that were an onerous obligation on the property. So as part of the board policy, they approved this additional support. And these are kind of the steps that we followed. We had a property valuation at $48 million. So that was split in half. So FORA's received $24 million, City Marina received $24 million. I know this has since been negotiated with a second implementation agreement with the Dunes, but this was in 2005. In step 2, they established the building removal cost. So in the memorandum of agreement, it set the cost at $46 million, and that the buildings would be removed concurrent with phases. So it's broken down into 3 phases. Right now, what you see at the Dunes on Monterey Bay project is phase 1. That's being completed as we see today. And then also in step 3, we established the sales price. So Marina received their million, or they will receive them in phases, their dollars, and FORA will receive credits as each phase proceeds. And then step 4, FORA's additional support was established in the agreement. So FORA has paid out already in phase 1 $22 million in cash and applied some credits for the land that was transferred in phase 1. In the East Garrison agreement, it's very similar to the Dunes on Monterey Bay. In step 1, there was a valuation of the property. It was a value of $1.5 million plus participation payments after the project achieved certain profits at the end. And in step 2, they established the building removal cost at $2.177 million, and that was for the World War II era buildings, the buildings that did not have the historical adobe and the historical value to them. So then in step 3, we established the sales price the county received $750,000, and for $750,000 would be applied to building removal credit. And that was established as FORA support to fund the full building removal of $2.177 million. And so FORA's building removal credit was applied, and then the participation payments would fund the rest. Okay, so this is just a quick map just to orient us on 2 remaining areas of building removal responsibility for FORA. So surplus 2, as Stan covered before, and the Marina Stockade up here. So in surplus 2, this is FORA's remaining obligation here. There are 27 concrete buildings on approximately 50 acres on this property. It's an economic development conveyance property. There's a current exclusive negotiating agreement with between Seaside and KB Bakewell. There's an appraised value of the property of $8.7 million, and then there's an estimated building removal cost of $19 million. So when you look at those 2 numbers together, you have a negative land value of $10.3 million. And so it's still pending as to the remaining steps in the process. The developer is still in the exclusive negotiating agreement stage, and FORA is moving ahead with its building removal obligation. So what the FORA board established as FORA's obligation was a dollar amount of $4 million in 2005, and we've indexed that to 2017 dollars. So it's now $5.5 million. So looking at another FORA remaining building removal obligation is the Marina Stockade. This is a former military prison. There are 7 buildings total on the site, and there are 13.4 acres on the site. FORA's obligation is estimated at $2.1 million, and FORA's obligation here is set to take down the buildings. So if the buildings cost more, FORA will cover that. If they cost less, FORA will take down those buildings. it's just the history behind this is the board approved this in 2005, and Marina has recently requested FORA reassign its obligation. So that's just a status of this project. Okay, so looking at yes.
Marina has not asked for that to be reassigned. The point was the consideration of that was if that was available to the city of Marina, if FORA was amenable, should we ask? So I don't want anybody in the room to think this is a position taken by the city of Marina. As of right now, the city of Marina is expecting the stockade to be removed.
Okay. So I apologize for that. Okay. So looking at potential policy adjustments. So these are just things to consider as we move ahead and think about the building removal topic in general. So FORA had the building removal hierarchy established in the 1990s. So one policy adjustment would be to eliminate this, and primarily because it's no longer economically feasible. So in the hierarchy, reusing buildings in place was on the hierarchy. After the time that's passed and the cost to bring the buildings up to code and remediate the hazards, it's just not economically feasible, nor is relocating to another site. So another policy potential adjustment would be to adjust FORA's building removal funding. This was part of those discussions with Marina of potentially reassigning stockade funds to other Marina buildings. As we just discussed, that was part of the discussion. Another policy funding adjustment could be to increase additional support for building removal on former Fort Ord in certain areas. Another policy adjustment could be for FORA to seek a disposal variance and related state waivers. This would be through the California Department of Toxic Substances Control. So that goes back to part of Stan's presentation, where FORA has characterized these World War II era buildings, the waste, the lead in these buildings, and the state would review that characterization and determine that the local landfill could take on the waste. And so that would be a cost savings because of the cost of transporting the waste all the way to Nevada or Central Valley to the local landfill. There's a large cost savings there. Another policy adjustment or consideration could be continue to utilize the FORA's hazardous waste generator designation. The upside of that is it would limit jurisdiction's risk, but however it would depend on an extension of FORA. Here it's just looking at some potential impacts for those policies. The second policy of looking at increasing building removal funding. If we increase the land sales funding towards building removal, it would likely drive up FORA's CFD or development fee. But a positive aspect of that is the faster building removal happens, it could speed up economic recovery. And then here are just a few ideas to chew on, looking at a bigger picture, a big idea of comprehensive building removal on the base. So potential ways to take down more buildings on the base. We could look at bonding future revenues, such as property taxes. Another potential could be to establish a building removal revolving fund, where we would have maybe land sale dollars set up, let's say $10 million just as an example, and we select an area on the base to use those dollars for building removal, and then that once those buildings are removed from, say, a 10-acre site or a 50-acre site, then the land is sold, and then those funds come back into that building removal fund, and another area is targeted for building removal. So that's just a replenishing fund that could take down buildings on the base. And third consideration might be to assign more land sales dollars to building removal on the base in the current FORA policy.
Okay, Chair, we thought maybe this would be a good opportunity for board members to exchange some ideas or thoughts on this, or ask more questions of staff. And I saw several folks writing as we were going through the process. So would you like to, the chair return to you so that you can oversee those questions, or would you like me to continue?
let's see, I think you had said you wanted to be kind of informal, so I think it's best if I stay out as chair, rather to keep it more informal, and if things get too chaotic, then I'll step in with my heavy hand.
Okay, so Jerry?
And I think if we can have the board kind of focus as much as we can on questions, then I'd like to open it up to the public for questions and comments so that there's enough time for us to discuss what the public might have brought up, as well as staff being able to answer their questions before we get too much further towards the noon hour. Thanks.
It seems like the most obvious economically advantageous fix would be for if we could get Congressman Jimmy Panetta to introduce legislation, maybe a change in the rule for brownfields or some sort of legislation. I mean, we're looking at contaminated buildings, lead, asbestos. They were using gasoline, very, very thin paint. All that obviously fell on the ground, which means that the ground around those buildings is contaminated with lead. So there might be a way of using the brownfields, or there might be a way he could introduce legislation to get, if not total funded, partially funded to help us get out of this mess. It's destroying the economic viability of this region. The marina and seaside can't move forward with a healthy development program as long as these things are there. So he's the 600-pound gorilla in this area. Hopefully he could introduce legislation and get some results.
That wasn't a question, but I think that is a good note. We have both at the staff level and at the board level testified that this brownfields restriction is a barrier to us in front of Congress in the past. Most recently, 2 years ago, in September 2015, that was my testimony in front of Congress. And so there are at least a half a dozen congressmen who have already written back to me saying they would like to sponsor that legislation. Maybe I can turn their names over to Congressman Panetta and see if he wants to work with them. Alan?
So since land sale has funded building removal, what will happen if and when FORA sunsets for land that has not been sold up to that point, and how will buildings be removed? Obviously, we can ask the federal government, but when the federal government is, not spending a lot more revenue, that seems like a long shot. So how would buildings be removed after 2020?
FORA's share, the 50% share, would expire with the legislation that expires June 30, 2020. I think there would be other revenues that would expire. Those revenues would then wind up going to the jurisdiction. The jurisdiction would have to make its own decisions how it wanted to spend those resources. But I would assume the jurisdiction will then have the obligation, 100% of the obligation, to make it happen. So it seems most jurisdictions would make that decision, but I can't speak for Marina or Seaside or the county as to how they would decide that. But clearly that's where the decisions would be made.
I'm a little confused though too on like the land sale prices being discounted 50%. If that's supposed to take care of the building removal, where are the additional costs coming from? Why doesn't the discounted land sale account for the building removal cost?
So 100% of the property that went through the jurisdictions, through the economic development conveyance, through FORA, when the valuation of the property is done to determine fair market value, the property is priced with the consideration that you have to remove these buildings to use the property. So a great example is Sea Haven or Marina Heights. That property had a couple of hundred buildings on it that had to be removed before buildings could replace it. That property, 100 acres plus, 172 acres, sold for something like $10 million for residential redevelopment because of the consideration that it was tens, if not over $100 million of building removal to take everything down and clear the property in order to be able to make that happen. So 100% of the property. There is an additional revenue provided by FORA to three specific areas, well, three jurisdictions, but to a specific select group, because the cost of taking all of that down is an additional financial burden So FORA provides an additional from its share of land sales revenue or lease revenue to take down buildings.
So where the cost exceeds the value of the appraised value of the land, for example.
Well, even when it doesn't exceed the value, because the Dunes project is a good example. Even with recognizing the cost of removing all the buildings, there was still a price established for the Dunes project. FORA's 50% share of that land sales revenue goes back in to the Dunes project to provide additional support, because the cost of taking all those buildings down and then carrying that cost is a particularly significant burden when you've got hundreds of buildings to take down. So that's why we're talking about additional. I don't know what the right word to use, but all property is appraised, recognizing the buildings have to be removed, and then FORA established a policy to provide additional support in the select areas where these buildings were being removed. So that's been FORA's policy, and that's what we've done for 15 years. No, Cynthia, you were, and then Dennis.
Thank you. You've talked a couple of times about being FORA's role as the hazardous waste generator designation, and that because it's a governmental entity, it doesn't incur the same fees. So I recognize that serving that function also has some expertise within it that's of significant value, but it's not just FORA. Any of the jurisdictions, the county, would qualify for that waiver of fees as well, correct?
I think
I can answer that, Michael.
yeah. Okay.
Yes, they could, but they take on the liability that's associated with that waste.
As long as in your construct of your governmental entity it included that task. There's some cases it would not, and that's why I was hesitating for a second. Gail, you were next.
Yes, so that was one of my questions, was could the city of Marina be in a position to qualify for that? And as the hazardous waste manifest signing those, has there been any out-of-pocket losses that FORA has had to bear in that standing?
Just in our insurance coverage to make sure it was understood our full practices.
And
then we did do some application, and we did make a request for the exemption, so minor costs.
So that insurance coverage is separate from the coverage policy that we had previously purchased all as jurisdictions. This is a separate policy, separate liability policy.
No, it's just the increased part of the premium for our general liability.
Okay. So we've extended that as individual jurisdictions bought portions of that policy. Is that the policy we're talking about? I think we're talking about a different policy. So my question is... Yes, the jurisdictions have participated in that policy, yes. Okay. So that policy could be extended beyond the existence of FORA? And you don't need to answer it today. It's just a question that if the city and jurisdictions were to step in, would that policy be able to be extended is the question. I know the pollution legal liability policy we anticipate will extend beyond FORA's life, and there will be a primary named entity depending on what happens. Right. So there's lots of options here, yes. It's not excluded for sure. So I want to go back to the idea that there's a cost in the building removal, and to Director Hoffa's questions, because I think it's somewhat misleading in the sense that there's additional dollars exchanged. So, for example, with the promontory, the most recent sale of land in Marina, is that the developer looks at the land as a value of 1.8 million. Let me use that number, 1.8 million. If the land were presented for sale and they didn't have a building on it, a developer would look at that and say, oh, this land has a value of 2.8 million. The fair market value developer is saying, I'm willing to pay Marina 1.8 million because once I get this property, I'm buying it as is, and I've got to take on the assumption and bear the cost of scraping that earth and getting it ready for me to build student housing. So now the city of Marina gets 1.8 million, and we send our 900,000 to FORA, or 900,000, and we keep 900,000, and that 900,000 goes into our general fund that we are able to allocate to pay for the lights and our staff or whatever other capital programs that we want to put the money in. And by board policy, it's been set up as a policy decision at this board that FORA is going to collect that 900,000 from land sales and use that for building removal. But building removal isn't going to happen on the promontory. That 900,000 now goes into an unallocated pot of money that I'm assuming, and this is where I'm getting to my question, is in 2005, FORA looked at the totality of the locations and said the cost of removing the building, the blight, at the stockade will exceed the sale price no matter what we do. Or the Surplus 2 project in Seaside, the cost of removal will exceed the sales price. So we're going to direct our land sale money to those two projects. Is that what we're understanding from the 2005 board decisions? It's very simplified.
I'll be precise because we didn't know land sales. We didn't take into account that it was underwater, just that it was a significant additional burden. There was no analysis about appraised value.
Okay.
So in the case of the Surplus 2 property in Seaside, I think that appraisal was only done a year ago, approximately. At the time that we made this decision about additional building removal, Seaside was going to reuse most of those buildings. So it wasn't a disposal. It was, we were providing additional dollars to help with hazmat abatement primarily. And in the case of the dunes, as I mentioned, the dunes project always had an established value. We added dollars back in that would be part of FORA's share.
Okay, so to go back to that dunes project, and maybe this is something that's of more interest to the city of Marina, but I think everybody needs to understand it. On your slide, you're indicating there was $22 million that came from FORA. Was that an actual cash transfer, $22 million, that we, FORA, wrote a check and gave it?
Well, a series of checks.
A series of checks. So we've written those dollars, and all of those dollar fundings came from land sales.
Yes.
Okay.
Either land sales or lease revenues. We had a pot of funds that was the same. We get some, but yes.
Okay.
That's correct.
So now going to back to the stockade, taking down the stockade in Marina. So we all agree today that FORA has made a board policy decision that the two remaining obligations that FORA will do, whether it sunsets in 2020 or extends to 2050, is that the board has set a policy saying we're going to take down the stockade in Marina at whatever cost, and we're going to fund the removal of $5.5 million as far as that money extends for
Surplus
2. And after that, there's no further assistance being given financially for blight removal to any jurisdiction, correct?
That's the current policy.
Okay.
These are the remaining two items from the board's decision from years ago about where FORA would provide assistance.
And so this board has the discretion in 2017 to change that board policy to decide that we want to do more as a board if we have the funding.
Absolutely.
And then the question becomes, is the land revenue sales funding the sole source of funding? Or can we expand and look for additional funding within funding sources that come into FORA currently, or new sources of funding? Correct?
Yes.
So that's the discussion that we're all trying to have. And so for the city, when we looked at your slide, this is going back to Stan's slide, where he showed the number of buildings that were remaining, 581 buildings to remove. 91.785% of those are in the city of Marina. 236 buildings are in Marina, unsupported by FORA, and 34 buildings are in the county and city. So when you're looking at the dunes, the $24 million FORA land sales, that money is already allocated, already been paid. That's coming from future. I don't quite understand that slide.
So there's quite a, and I want to be careful here because there is a legal challenge to the question in Marina Heights, so I'm going to be very circumspect about my comments. There is a dispute regarding this issue, but we have an agreement, the agreement with Marina Community Partners / Shea Homes, that governs this $46 million in support. Yes, the $22 million in cash has gone forward, and for 8 years now, we have carried on our CIP the fact that there's a $24 million credit going forward from future phases of the Dunes project that would come from revenues that would be paid to FORA under the agreement. Instead, that would go back into the Dunes project. That's a credit to the Dunes project in that agreement. The dispute is about more cash versus credit, but those basic terms, whether it's 22, 23, 24, 21, 20, those numbers is what we're disputing. But the fact that there is a total of $46 million, some in cash, some in credit, is accepted by both parties.
So I guess that's the distinction I'm having, or the problem I'm having to understanding following this is the word credit. Mm-hmm. So let's go back to my example about the promontory. Mm-hmm. Is that we all agreed the promontory sold for $1.8 million as the fair market value. And some of these slides, you're indicating that that extra million that puts it up to 2.8 is a land value credit, which I disagree with that being a characterization. But is that the kind of credit that you're talking about here, or are you talking about a credit that of the $900,000 in my promontory, that $900,000 is supposed to go back, and in this case, the Dunes, $24 million of the purchase price, for us half of the purchase price yet to come, is supposed to go back?
That's correct. That's after the appraised value, after the agreements. What the future would look like is that half of that, there's a total of X amount of dollars in the future. Of that, 50%, for its 50% share, net the appraised value, net transfers. This is the second of your two examples. It's of the $900,000 for your promontory example that FORA would put the money that would come to FORA that might be used in Seaside or Delray Oaks or someplace else would stay with that project for building removal.
Okay. So that's what it's use of the word credit in two different relationships. There is what I'm trying to sure I'm understanding.
I'm trying to make it as clear as I can. I hope it's not mud.
I appreciate that clarification. But the only thing that I do have to indicate is that recently we had a presentation at Marina City Council that indicated the city of Marina was paid $6 million for phase 1 of the Dunes project, and we gave $3 million to FORA. So I'm not sure where these numbers.
Those were credits. So when phase 1 happened, so the Dunes is broken down into 3 phases. They're in the middle of phase 1 right now. The developer has received phase 1 property. So when they received the land from Marina received dollars. So that's the $3 million that you're referring to. FORA didn't receive its 50%. It plowed that into the building removal.
Okay.
So that will happen in the remaining 2 phases as well. Marina will get cash. FORA will just be assured that building removal happens on the site.
Okay. So the assumption is the property actually sells for, in this $48 million, to generate $24 million for FORA.
Yeah, those are the terms of the agreement that Marina has with the developer.
Thank you.
Dennis, please.
Thanks, Michael. I think my question may have been answered already, but I'll throw it out there just to make sure. So when building removal, when that cost is figured into the price of the land, and because of market prices as such brings into the negatives. Right now, FORA support is supposed to keep that above water, and but that depends on the present cost of destruction and board policy, and that could change given the time. Yes, sir.
I'll rephrase what your question so that I don't say no to you, if I can help it. FORA does not assure that property stays above water. The jurisdictions negotiate these land sales transactions between. They are the ones that are privy to the contract with the developer. They make the determinations, whether it's the county or Delray Oaks. FORA reviews those to determine that those agreements are consistent with our implementation agreement and stave off. And that, so the FORA board will concur in an agreement that's negotiated by the jurisdiction. Jurisdiction generally winds up doing either a appraisal at fair market value for the property, and they determine that one way or another, or they'll do an income-based evaluation by an economist. In the case of the Dunes project, it was a revenue / generating income-based evaluation. So we don't guarantee, though, that it stays above water. In the case of Seaside in Surplus 2, Seaside requested a certain amount of support to help with projects, and Seaside at that time anticipated reusing the buildings rather than tearing them down. So they asked for a different dollar amount. When the FORA board made the policy, it was based on a different set of facts. Seaside wasn't selling the property in the same way that it is now. So terms and conditions have changed, is the best way to answer your question. We will always work with jurisdictions to help any way we can. Sometimes in the case of Seaside, they're putting multiple projects together to make them all work economically, but that's between Seaside and its developer. Does that help? Joe?
Mine covers probably a little different subject. Some of the property went to TAMC, MST, and the Veterans Transition Center. How are these folks going to be held accountable for what they do with the asbestos if FORA goes away in 2020? And they can't sell that property because that was given to them as public benefits. So they're burdened with this. How do we assure for the environmentalists and for the communities that stuff's not going to get dumped in our landfill? Who's going to be holding these folks accountable?
So there are some assurances that everyone has. Every time there's a public benefit conveyance or an economic development conveyance, MST, TAMC was actually an economic development conveyance, or the City of Marina. City of Marina has some obligations outside of the EDC parcel. Whenever that happens, everyone has to meet the same requirements for disposal of asbestos, lead, PCBs, and the demolition of the building. So all have to do the hazmat required work. Most cases, the public benefit conveyance request requires the applicant to say how they will deal with the building issues, how they will remove them, and so forth. This board approved Monterey Bay Charter School, and that project was going to move ahead on California State University, Monterey Bay. They had an agreement to move ahead. There's a big struggle in the federal government right now because one of the reasons FORA said we will do additional help, the federal government doesn't recognize the building removal and doing its fair market value. And Monterey Bay Charter School, Anya Spears here can talk about it, is fighting a tremendous uphill battle, and that the federal government won't recognize the asbestos or the lead or any of that in their looking at the valuation. So we do have some assurances because you have to meet those requirements. There has been some struggle because the funding for the individual projects that are public benefit conveyances are much more difficult to get. Veterans Transition Center is attempting to expand its housing. It doesn't have enough water. It does have a big grant from the state. There's a bunch of issues that are evolving around that. So all of them are put together. Building removal is just one of the issues, but I think we're guaranteed that when that project moves ahead, it gets reviewed here at the FORA board. Because even if that's a different question. You still have individual jurisdictions that before they're going to approve a project, they're going to make sure that it meets their building code requirements, that it's still going to be processed and planning appropriately. So I think whether FORA is here or not, you'll have some assurances. I doubt any of our government agencies that receive property are not going to use it properly anyway, but that's what I would say. Chair?
I'd like to ask a fairly general question, and then if there are any other people with questions on the board, let's get those asked, because we're coming quickly up on the time when we said we would end. And I do want the public to have a chance, and I don't know, are people amenable to sticking around till 12:15 or 12:30 if we need to get the public's stuff answered? Great, thanks. So I think one thing that is clear is that FORA thought of building removal in one way at the beginning. It's worked to a degree, but a lot of things have changed between then and now. So I'd like to get, it looks like there are 633 buildings remaining. Some of them have some FORA support to be removed. I don't know if the amount of money that is available to FORA is sufficient, but what I'd like to know is, you know, of the buildings, of the number of buildings that still remain to be taken down, how many do we think we can take down with existing funding? And I'm looking at, let's see if we can do this quickly. So, because what I'd like to see is how big of an issue do we have here, and then what do we need to do with our various options for generating revenue to get the job done. So I guess I'd like to understand, of the 633 buildings that are remaining, how much do we think that's going to cost to bring them down properly, and essentially how much money do we have to make that happen in the near term. So what are we looking at to, you know,
Chair,
what's remaining?
I know this is risky, and board members have asked me to be as clear as possible so that no one's misled about this. I don't know the number of what it's going to cost, but let's just take a wild guess. And I want to be careful about this because I don't want anybody misled or thinking this number is going to get quoted in the newspaper. But the price for taking a building down, the smaller ones, is in the $30,000 to $40,000 to $50,000 range. The bigger ones are $1 million because there's more of the smaller ones. I guess we're probably talking between $100,000 and $150,000 a copy. If it's $100,000 a copy, that's $63 million. If it's $153,000 a copy, it's about $100 million to get the rest of the buildings in here taken down. We already know that FORA can take 24 of those down. That's what we have money for right now. We know that the folks at the Dunes project have a $24 million credit, or $22 million, depending on what the disputes is. So we know there's some money there to take those down. So if we really frame this, that's what you're asking me to do, I'd say I'd frame it that it's a $30 to $50 million question about how do we make other things happen, and how many of the buildings are taken down by the 24. But the real big issues are not the numbers of buildings. The real big issues are in Seaside, the Hammerheads are a big number, and the Dunes project where we don't have funds that the 24 million won't cover. Those are the biggest, I would say.
So we're looking at a kind of a financing question. Yeah.
That was my question too, how much it would cost to take them down, and also that I think that we really do have an argument that could, I would hope, be heard by the government to do some funding. And my concern also was that some of the buildings may not be land that would bring in revenue, but would not be in a location for resale, so the revenue wouldn't be there for the jurisdiction, and that's my concern as well, that they would not have that recourse. So I think we really do need to push hard, because to get this property free, as we did, has turned out not to be the case, and I think that's a good argument. I'd like to go forward as hard as we can with that argument.
Alan?
So going back to Director Morton's question, so, you know, what are our options for identifying other funds to be able to expedite building removal? I guess I just want to put on the table the idea that our transportation plan, that would be one place, you know, if you redesigned the transportation plan, some of those funds might be reallocated to building removal. And I'm one, in particular, I broached this idea, I think, at a past FORA meeting, that is it possible that something like the East Side Parkway, which is a very expensive part of the transportation plan, could be re-scoped, scaled back, in some ways so that we're reusing some existing roadways and maybe making them more efficient. That's, I want to say it's something like $20 million for that project. So that would go a long way if it could be scaled back to filling the gap.
Yes, Chair. I'll ask members of the public if you have some questions that you want to pose before a board. Lane Long.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the presentation. Actually, I've learned a lot, generated a lot of questions, and have a few comments overall. I'm still a little confused on the policy and not the policy on blight removal, because when Stan started off his presentation, he said there's really no written policy on blight removal, but we keep on referring to policy, and he said it's kind of in the CIP program, and so I'm not sure if there really is a written policy or not on blight removal. It'd be nice to know if there actually is a written policy on that. I have a question on, so why was Cypress Knolls left out of the equation on blight removal, those 232 homes? And that was way history.
Cypress Knolls, early in the closure of Fort Ord, the city of Marina was approached by, I think it was Lutheran Homes, and they were going to take over that project as it sat at that time. They were duplexes, the homes were ready to move in. They were going to pretty much start a community there and buy the property from the city of Marina. That fell through. Over time, another developer came on. The buildings had deteriorated. They were looking at maybe using only slabs only and building up from there. That didn't work out. The developer left, abandoned the project. I think they're on there about, Marina was on there about their fifth developer, and the buildings have deteriorated more and more over time. That's why it was never addressed originally.
So you're saying it was initially thought there'd be developers coming in, therefore they would address, that would become part of the package of the removal, but now that there's no developers, we still have the homes. I can give you some numbers from what we have, like with Marina Heights, that just last year finished their removal of their homes. The single story homes are about 22.5, maybe 23, 24,000. The two-story go up to 50,000. So when we look at Cypress Knolls, those 232 homes, they're probably anywhere between $7, $8, $9 million. They've also told us that every year as it goes on, those costs are exponentially increasing, because right now they can still go in and salvage out the asbestos and the lead, but as they decay more and more, those parts that they used to be able to take to a regular disposal site after they remove the lead and asbestos, those are quickly getting to the point where they're just going to have to take everything down to the hazardous waste site, and so the cost is going up, and at least they're telling us here they still think we can salvage it out, but if we wait too much longer, that cost is really going to go escalate quite a bit, and so that's a concern on our end. I had a question on the Preston Park land sales. So did that money go back into blight removal, or did that go into your CIP fund? And I know that some of these you probably can't answer here, but I'm just tossing it out. I want to understand where those went.
I think this is as direct an answer as I can give. The money that's going to be going into the stockade and into surplus 2 is our land sales revenue. It's pretty directly from the Preston Park sale.
So those will be, for the most part, directed into blight removal.
The Finance Committee made several recommendations to the board over the last couple of years since that closed. Some of the funds went to retiring certain PERS obligations. Other part of the funds are going into building removal. So that's not the only source.
Okay.
Well, yeah, and actually, of the sales price, just under $18 million retired an existing loan that was used for General Jim Moore.
Thank you. Marinas, where we have our city park parcel that has all those homes on it, or the blight on it. So are funds able to be allocated to that, or is that a PBC parcel and therefore FORA can't allocate any funds towards? So this is the parcel that's across from the Rose City Hockey. That's our city park parcel.
The city, when it made its application for use of that property, took on the obligation and responsibility for everything in that property.
Okay.
If there are other members of the public, I want to make sure everybody gets a chance, Lane. I'll give you another to come back, but I want to make sure we're not, because we only have board members for a little while. So can you hold questions for a second and see if we can get more folks that have questions? Anyone else? There is
a
any more.
30-second one, and I'm done.
You only have one more?
One
Please,
more, and
go
I'm
ahead,
done.
Lane.
And this is kind of, I think, answers some of the questions that were brought up on how do we fund it in the future. And it mentioned how you'd CFD and property taxes going to the fund. Well, I think that really is critical, and it's kind of this chicken and the egg thing. You'll look at the property tax revenue that FORA is now getting. This past year has probably increased several $100,000 a year because of the new developments that are going on. And so I think if we can allocate more money to the blight removal so we can actually get development going on the property, you'll see your property taxes will increase substantially, and that will help us long term. And at the same time, if you get development, you're going to get your CFD fees also. Versus if we don't allocate anything towards the blight removal, then we just sit here, and if we allocate it to other projects, we aren't able to tap these other revenue sources that are available.
Lane, that's brilliant, because that's exactly what the FORA board thought of when it said we're going to add dollars years ago, and doing that now would have the same effect.
Thank you.
Kathy?
My name is Kathy Biala, and I'm a resident of Marina. First, I wish to thank you for the very informative presentation. The legacy of FORA and of the military should not be the inescapable visibility of dilapidated barracks with broken windows, porches dangling from its faces, lead paint peeled off, and doors broken in to expose asbestos to the homeless. You know this, and we know this. In hindsight, I know FORA must be regretting not having acted sooner, and the legacy of the military deserves a better scenario. This blight does not belong next to Montage Health Center or REI or the not yet open VA outpatient center or the newly constructed Dunes homes or as a gateway to Marina. Please make this a critical priority of those buildings in Marina that are now directly in view of major new commercial and residential developments. These are all apparently not FORA supported at this time. Thank you very much.
Are there others?
Thank you, George Riley. I have more questions than I'm expecting answers, but I had a couple. One thing about the credits that are available to a developer or jurisdiction with a development project. Has there been an explanation of how the credit system will exist over time beyond the termination date? It seems like that's a complicated piece of the transfer. I'm wondering, a little bit like Kathy just commented, I wonder if the least costly buildings are the most visually awful buildings be given a high priority for removal, because that is, from my context, the pigsty that prevents developers from getting interested. So I'm just wondering if they could be a high priority. Another version of that idea is to look at the less costly buildings first as opposed to the more costly buildings to remove. And I wonder if that could be a way to prioritize getting more buildings down as opposed to just a particular building down. I think the financing thing, it's always been curious to me why the community facilities
district funding is restricted to other expenses and not building demolition or building removal. And it just seems to me that is an option that clearly exists with the FORA board and couldn't be a way to add more money to the short range of this. I do have a little concern about, let's see, one other question on that. Can the sales revenue that does go back into building removal be earmarked for the jurisdiction where it was generated rather than the general fund for FORA? Just a question about a priority scheme. And my last comment is simply, maybe off the wall. Can the hazmat material be stockpiled on Fort Ord somewhere so that the developer does not have to, at that one time, remove it all? And so several development options could be going on. At least the building removal material could be stockpiled on site. And I don't know how you protect it, and I don't know how that happens, but at the time it's removed, it can be a separate project that doesn't have to fall on an individual developer, and it may be cost attractive if you're dealing with a high volume material of removal at one time rather than piecemealing it by developer.
Okay.
You want me to address that one, Michael?
Hold on a second, Stan. Okay. Because I counted 6 questions that we'll try to address, but I think there's others that want to get their questions posed. So is there another question? Another comment? Okay, seeing none. Do you have a comment? Okay, there we go.
My name is Lisa Berkeley, and I'm a resident of Marina. I'm also president of the U.S. West Coast Chapter of Women in International Security. And I'd like to speak not just about the in-the-weeds, very relevant economic work we're talking about, but also about the overall future of this area. Since its inception, Fort Ord has always been about security and maintaining and protecting that which is beautiful. Originally as a military base, the security was focused upon training soldiers and to protect what this country is founded upon, democracy and equal opportunity. When it was turned over to civilian use, it was to protect nature and the endangered species, from Smith's blue butterfly to the Contra Costa goldfields and the California tiger salamander. As we move forward, the question comes to mind is, what can we do that honors the legacy of security and protection that's laid the foundation for this property? And so really, when I look at Marina today, we're at the precipice of losing what makes it unique. Its diverse socio-ethno and economic population. And on one hand, we have a growing population that is shifting to a higher socio-economic bracket, with which one might argue is good for the community and obviously very relevant to today's topic. However, we also have a housing crisis in Marina on our hands. It's exhibited by the number of homeless people on Lapis Road, for example, people who can no longer afford to live here. Isn't it our responsibility as leaders of this community to offer protection and care? Perhaps skills and tools to enable these people to get their feet back on the ground into the homes, and something like that, some kind of social program which can help get people back on the ground and include them in the cleaning up process might be relevant or helpful. So I'd like to suggest that FORA and all relevant parties have the courage to think outside of the box, and that we can engage with creative possibilities and solutions. For example, like I mentioned, provide affordable housing and allow the people who are in need of work and may have the very practical labor skills to do the building with proper training. Anyway, just a quick comment of taking a moment to look at the bigger picture of what is the purpose of this land and what was it intended for. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Gene Doherty. I'm a resident of Marina and have some background in appraising, background in demolition, and background in planning. And I was curious if you're the FORA staff, all the people who lived in those dilapidated buildings, worked in those buildings longer than most of the Army people did, are concerned about the carcinogenic effects of the exposure that they all had for those years living in these buildings next to us here, and with the asbestos and lead base that you were all exposed to for long periods of time. So I hope you have good insurance policies. I also But I also want confused as to why the priority for the removal of the obvious blight that is so relevant and so people can see and so high is the lowest priority. Don't even mention it too much, and it's just a dunes project issue maybe, and yet it's the most. It seems to be the easiest, as the previous speakers spoke to, because it's not a very costly. They're not as costly as some of the other buildings to remove. They're right here. Everybody sees them, and they're all around you, and yet nobody seems to have a very high priority. And I thank you, Director Morton, for showing the way that we possibly can. And I hope you don't leave us with this as your legacy. Thank you.
Doug?
Thank you, Michael, members of the board. A couple of comments. First, I want to thank Stan Cook, who was a great help during the demolition and deconstruction of the Dunes project in the past. He is a great resource to this group and effort, and Stan, I think you should be applauded for all the hard work that you do on the demolition and decon, so I want to say thanks for that. Secondly, I'd like to say I appreciate the comments that I'm hearing relative, particularly from the board members, relative to looking at ways to get at the buildings that are most blighted first, or most obvious to blight, or contribute most obvious to blight to the public. Believe me, as a person who works in one of those buildings on the hill up here daily, I'll check my insurance policy, that I'd love nothing more than to have those buildings removed as quickly as possible, and applaud any effort to do so, as they are specifically tied to land sale credits and cash, but they're tied to land sale credits and to take down of future land, then it's wholly dependent, of course, upon the economics of that future phase and what those economics are going forward in the market. Love to be able to just continue forward phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and keep going, and that's our intent, assuming the market is there and the cost factors that make it feasible are there. So I applaud your efforts to do that. Just finally then, the understanding that all of these resources, land sales, CIP fees, or impact the CFD fees, development impact fees, lease proceeds, they all come from one source: development. Unless you can get a great federal grant, and I applaud the effort to go and talk with Mr. Panetta Jr. to do that, or Senior maybe, to bring in and look at those ideas, because I think that is a great idea to look at some of that. But remember, it comes from development, and it comes from those sources, and at the end, we're, as a developer, proud to be able to do our part and to move as quickly as we can, given the market and any assistance that you can provide. Thank you.
Okay, I think we've got to be... So those are questions and comments. I want to thank all of the members of the public for those comments and questions. I'm going to try to take a shot at answering these really quickly for the board members, and a couple of these we're going to punt and maybe provide on our website an answer that's a little more detailed. George Riley was the one that came up with 6 questions, and you asked about credits was the first item. Credits are an important, I would call it, methodology that certainly is available to the board in the future. In each case, this work is being done by agreement, so it's a case-by-case basis. The only place where we have credits, only places, are in East Garrison and on the Dunes project right now. That's the only places, and we use it by agreement. So in each case, we're looking at future land sales that we're giving a credit to the developer and saying, instead of paying $10 million, you pay $5 million, or instead of paying $1 million, you pay $500,000. So that's the credits that we've used to make that happen. With respect to making these visible buildings a high priority, the board has done that, and I think if you probably saw a couple of things that you've seen up here where these buildings are. We're right here on 12, and right on 2nd, we started taking the buildings down that were most apparent. We don't own all of the buildings that are seen from the freeways, others that own many of those buildings. And some of those are either PBCs or EDCs. We have worked with MST and TAMC and others to see what we can do to help them, but we're not privy to their contracts or their agreements for their PBC agreements. So there's work that we still need to do, and that's not to say it's impossible, because we've found ways in the past to help. But it's a little bit of a struggle. We clearly agree that getting the buildings that are visible down is important. And so that's why when Marina said we should at least consider, if we have some funds now, where we best spend them, that maybe it's better to spend them in a higher visibility area. And so its staff concurs that that's worth the board thinking about and working, in this case, with Marina. With respect to less costly versus more expensive, I agree with you that maybe there's more bang for your buck. These aren't as inexpensive as you think. The one-story buildings that are being potentially taken down in Cypress Knolls that might cost $25,000 are not comparable to the two-story barracks buildings that cost us $100,000 plus to take down. So for $500,000, you get 5 of those buildings. You might get a whole community in Cypress Knolls, but they're not visible. So there's trade-offs, George, and members of the board, if you understand what I'm saying. There are trade-offs in each of the decisions. And then with respect to CFD use, to change our CFD is a significant uphill battle because it requires an election, and it's an expensive proposition to conduct the election. But maybe it's worth doing. However, the CFD approach, or a mellow roofs, is available as a potential financing mechanism for jurisdictions moving forward. Because an additional CFD could be used. Maybe that helps the project move ahead. And that's another thought, because now it's allowed to be used for removal of materials that might be hazardous for other problems. So that could help. With respect to, can sales revenue be sent back to the individual parcels? You know, that's interesting. You might not want to do that. The places where you're likely to have land sales in the future are the more open space areas that are not where the buildings are. If you want to use land sales in the future, you might want to have the flexibility of making policy decisions as Delray Oak sells parcels, which are coming up fairly soon for a project that's approved, or Seaside sells property. You might want to think about that, how you do that, because right now you have the flexibility to establish priorities. If you put the property sales back into the individual property, it ties you down more. So just something to think about when the board makes a decision. And then, can hazmat be stockpiled? There are some very difficult restrictions, primarily from the Department of Toxic Substances Control, about removing any hazardous materials or dirt from your site to anybody else's. They're very tough to overcome. However, if you're talking about holding it someplace for some other future entity to take responsibility for it, clearing it, I'm not sure what you do with that toxic dump site you now have and what it gets characterized as, but we'll look at it and come back. But right now I know it'd be kind of tough to move it from site to site. The Army does it because they are taking Army contaminant waste, putting it in landfill, and then covering it with property they own, where it's legal to do that. But for us to do it would be a different story, I think. I'll look at it, though, George, and we can answer that question. With respect to the other person who's now gone, and about homeless and affordable housing, Councilmember Hoffa has clearly stated his preference for affordable housing, and we also know the board members are supportive of that. The City of Marina already provides a significant amount of homeless support from projects right here at Fort Ord and affordable housing. I think there are hundreds, if not well over 500 units of affordable housing in Marina, and I think there's something like 320 or 330 units of transitional or housing that's focused on folks with homeless issues in Marina. So there's quite a bit already here. But the possibility for more is still out there. And the last thing about the carcinogenic effect, I'm not touching that. So, members of the board, I think that's all we have for the workshop. Are there any final thoughts?
So my final thought, I know that we're trying to schedule a transportation workshop.
Yes.
And since we haven't gotten to the bottom of our funding resources about blight, what I am suggesting is that when we look at that transportation issue, that we include in that looking at the funding mechanisms that fund the transportation and exploring those also for blight. That the prioritizing, as Director Huff has indicated, can we, and I'm not saying do away with Eastside Parkway, that's my point is, can we consider that we postpone something in what is our current priorities in our CIP as a possibility for redirecting funds? And I do understand the 218 election issue, but everybody needs to understand what's that cost versus what does it generate. So it's much more of an exploratory in the sense of how we generate our funds for that, and then deciding the priorities about allocating it to which transportation and which blight removal.
We will be sending out another either MailChimp or Doodle poll on setting that up. We are refocusing our attention on Monday, August 7th, because we can only get 8 or 9 folks for any of the dates we gave the prior week. So I don't know about August 7th if it works or not, but that's the next. August 7th was a possible date, and then later in that August 7th, August 9th, and then the following Monday, which would be the 14th. Those were possible dates, but the Doodle poll, where's Dominique? Dominique will be sending out a Doodle poll or MailChimp to all the board members later. If you can, hopefully the 7th works, the afternoon, so that Alan Hoffa can attend and others who have morning obligations. But that's what we're focused on, the afternoon of the 7th as a possible date. Thank you, Chair.
Any other final board comments? Yes, Mr. Hoffa.
So the ammo storage buildings on Barlow Canyon, where are they as far as building removal priority goes? And then as a comment, I think they should be a low priority, and I can expand on that if anyone's interested. But
just to make it clear, so the record shows this, it is a low priority for the County of Monterey. There have been several people that are interested in using the buildings as they are currently built. So there's a possibility. I think there was line storage. We will have to do some checking because some people used to have some explosives and other items in there. But once they're cleared out, there are some other uses potentially for that site. But yeah, they're a lower priority.
Thank you. Anyone else? And I would just say, I think we heard from the public and from board members that there have been efforts made towards the building removal, but that I think it's really a priority to really look at all options to really get the job done sooner rather than later. And I think, you know, looking at the CIP in general, but also looking at other funding options that really maybe haven't been explored in the past will be really important moving forward. So thank you. Thanks again to staff for putting this on really clear.